channel and would like to sponsor the channel, then see the link in the description below for the Patreon page and start enjoying the benefits of being a patron of the 80s Slasher Librarian. And enjoy tonight's narration of Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand.
But remember, the risk of cheating the plan, of disrespecting the design, could incite a fury that could terrorize even the Grim Reaper. And you don't even want to fuck with that, MacDaddy.
Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand. Chapter 6. "You okay?" Tom asked softly. Allie started. She blinked and realized they were standing in the rear of the elevator, on their way down to the tower's lobby. She didn't even remember getting on. Standing just ahead of them, facing the door, were a man and woman. Although Allie couldn't see their faces, she surmised from the wrinkled flesh of their arms and the gray coloration of their hair that they were well past 60 and possibly from Florida, maybe from Southern California. If their deep tans were any indication, that is. They were together, no doubt, and had that touristy look to them. The summer prints on their shirts, large enough to cover their girth like gift paper wrapped around a couple of beach balls, and the dark pants were a dead giveaway. Allie particularly liked the old man's combination of black socks with brown loafers in a desert location. It reminded her of Grandpa Joey on her dad's side of the family. A classic look among senior citizens that never goes out of style, she thought with a wry smile. Tom leaned in closer and muttered, "You spaced out there for a little bit. Got a lot on your mind?" "Something like that," Allie replied uneasily. "Thanks for reminding me, Tom." She looked down and caught sight of the wedding bands the couple wore. The woman's was paired with the large diamond engagement ring she still wore, just below the gold band. Allie hesitantly touched her own ring, and for a moment she had the unsettling feeling that the elderly couple she was standing behind were really reversed reflections of her and Tom, years from now. A vision of the future, as it were. The Western omelet she'd had for breakfast suddenly felt like a stone settling in her stomach. Her throat burned with the taste of red peppers and bile. She closed her eyes and forced it back down, but the scorched sensation in her esophagus remained. "Allie?" She recognized the concerned tone in Tom's voice. Thankfully, the stopping bell sounded in the car before she could answer, and the elevator slowed. They'd arrived at the lobby. She opened her eyes to find Tom and the seniors staring at her, and was grateful to discover that the puffy, sun-baked features of the older woman proved she couldn't possibly be Allie's twin from the future. Allie wouldn't be caught dead wearing that much rouge on her worst day. "You all right, darling?" the woman asked as the elevator door opened. The car was immediately filled with the deafening array of rings, buzzes, whirs, and screeches. The sounds of a legion of slot machines all converging at once, their mechanical babble occasionally interrupted by all too human cheers and curses. "Yes, I'm fine," Allie said, smiling weakly. "It's just a little stuffy in here." That was an understatement. In truth, she was starting to feel absolutely claustrophobic with Tom and these people pressing close in on her. The man impatiently gestured for his wife to leave the car. "Step out, Ethel," he ordered. "Let the girl get some air. You'd rather stand around and watch her pass out from lack of oxygen, huh?" "There's no need for you to take that tone with me, Fred Newton," the woman replied stiffly. Nevertheless, she walked out of the car and moved to one side, her husband at her heels. Tom put his arm around Allie's waist, then took hold of her right arm at the elbow to guide her out of the elevator. "This really isn't necessary, Tom," she insisted as they stepped into the lobby. "I'll be fine in a minute." "That's what you used to say when we went out drinking," Tom replied. He steered her toward the lounge chairs a short distance from the front desk. "And the second I let go, you were falling flat on your face." "That's because I was totally shit-faced," she explained. "You see me hitting minibar in the room this morning?" "No, but we sure were last night," Tom answered. "You forget that already?" Allie grimaced. "No, but I'd like to." Reaching one of the lounge chairs, she took a seat and rested her head back. It wasn't the drinking that had sent her reeling. That was for damn sure. The argument they had had burned away all traces of the alcoholic haze she might have been feeling when she first woke up. Well, that and the shock of realizing she was now Mrs. All-Marine Goodwin Gaines, of course. "You sure you're all right, honey?" Ethel bleated into her ears, causing Allie to jerk back to reality. The old woman reached into her oversized purse, more like a brightly colored suitcase than a handbag, and rummaged around inside for a few moments. Finally, she pulled out her hand and shoved a big white plastic bottle toward Allie's face. "Maybe you just need a Tums." Allie held up her hands and forced a smile. "No, that's okay," she said. "I'm fine, really." "They're tropical flavors," Ethel replied, in a light sing-song fashion, like a mother trying to convince her kid to take their medicine. She rattled the bottle slightly as an enticement. Inside, chalky tablets the shape of tiny hockey pucks banged and clanked together, like they were made of stone. Yeah, that sounded really inviting. Allie shook her head. "Thanks, no." "Jesus Christ, Ethel, leave that girl alone," Fred said sharply. "She already told you she was okay." He turned to Allie and smiled. She noticed how his gaze dipped down for a second, just long enough to take a quick peek at her breasts before he made eye contact. "Me and Ethel, we've got 5 kids and 12 grandkids. Old habits die hard, you know. Sometimes she can't help mothering folks." "Smothering folks is more like it," Allie thought. But she nodded in an understanding way. "I appreciate the offer, though," she said to Ethel. "It was very kind of you." The old woman smiled and put away the bottle. "Maybe you should get some ginger ale just in case you feel queasy again. I'm sure they must sell it in one of the gift shops." "I will," Allie promised. Ethel nodded and turned to Tom. "You be sure and take care of your missus, okay?" she cautioned, wagging a thick index finger at him. "I know how wild this town can be. Fred and me have been coming here for over 30 years. We know the foolishness young people can get into with all the temptations around." She gestured toward her husband. "The two of us might fight like cats and dogs, but that don't mean we don't care about each other. You want your marriage to work, you've got to look out for each other." "Marriage?" Tom asked dully. She took his left hand, held it up, and pointed to the wedding band. "You think I didn't notice this when we got on this air elevator? I saw you fiddling with it all the way down in your reflection." Tom actually blushed and did his best to avoid Allie's gaze, so he was feeling a little of the weight himself. Ethel released his hand and turned back to Allie. "Just got hitched, huh? Now I know why you've got an upset stomach. Newlywed jitters, right?" She winked. "I went through the same thing when Fred and me tied the knot." She glanced at her husband. "Didn't I, Fred?" He shrugged. "You asking me to remember something that happened 30-odd years ago?" "You're right, I should have known better than to ask," she replied in a chiding tone. "After all, it was only our wedding night." She looked at Allie and shook her head in a despondent manner. "I shouldn't be so surprised. He was half in the bag most of our honeymoon anyhow." "Only because I was trying to drink the very thought of you into oblivion, you old harpy," Fred commented, then turned to Tom. "Didn't do a very good job of it, did I?" For once, Tom wisely kept his mouth shut. He just grinned awkwardly and shrugged. "So, like I was saying," Ethel continued, "you mind your wife. You can get distracted with all the pretty girls in this town, but it's the one you're married to you need to give attention to. Don't ruin what you just started because somebody tried to lead you down the wrong path." Sure," Tom said. Ethel then cast her eyes on Allie. "The same goes for you, young lady. You think you've got yourself a good man to watch out for you, you hold on to him tight and ignore any of the Johnny-come-latelys who come knocking at your door." She gave a sly grin. "Even if some of them do have bodies like Adonis." "Yes, ma'am," Allie replied, with a mocking smile. Fred grunted loudly. "You about done preaching to the congregation, minister?" he asked in a sarcastic tone. "The day's not getting any younger." "And neither are you," Ethel shot back. "Don't know why you're in such a hurry to get to gambling. You've never won anything in your life." "Of course I never win," Fred shouted. "Not when I gotta hear you harping all day long, putting the jinx on me." "So I'm a jinx now, am I?" Ethel asked in a stern tone. She went to cross her meaty arms across her broad chest, but had to settle for only locking her wrist in her hands. Fred rolled his eyes. "Oh, here we go!" He threw up his hands and started walking away. "Now just you wait a minute, Fred Newton," Ethel said as she stormed after him. Allie looked at Tom and shrugged. Apparently they'd already been forgotten. She turned back to see what was happening. As the older couple moved farther away, anything Ethel was saying was quickly drowned out by the louder casino noises. It was probably something heavy-duty, Allie imagined, watching Fred clamp his hands over his ears, or maybe he was just tired of hearing the same old arguments. His wife had 30-plus years of material to draw on, after all, and by now he'd no doubt heard it all. "Yeah, it must be love, all right," Allie sighed and glanced at Tom. "Still want to give it a chance?" "What, this marriage thing? Sure." He gestured in the direction of the Newtons. "You think that was bad? You haven't seen me and Will going at it." "Your aunt and uncle?" He nodded. "Like World War fucking III, every Thanksgiving. But you know what? Say something out of line to one of them and the other one'll be down your throat in a heartbeat, telling you to fuck off." Allie raised an eyebrow. "And that to you means they love each other?" "Well, they've been together, 12 or 13 years?" Tom replied. "So in some crazy way, yeah, I guess they do. Like what's her name?" "Ethel?" Allie interjected. He'd always been terrible at remembering names, starting right from the moment the person he'd been talking to walked away. He was great at remembering faces, though. Tom nodded. "Yeah, like Ethel was saying about her and her husband. They might fight a lot, but it doesn't mean they hate being together." Allie chuckled. "That's like the most fucked up logic I've ever heard. But I wasn't going to get into it with her. 30 years of arguing? Why would anyone be willing to put up with that much shit for that long?" "You ever ask your parents?" he replied. Her good mood quickly dissolved. "What's that supposed to mean?" Now it was Tom's eyebrow that did a slow upward crawl. "What? You gonna tell me you never heard your parents fight?" "No, but—" She paused, suddenly realizing his question wasn't meant to be a challenge. The heat of her gaze cooled considerably. "Oh, I get it." She nodded in agreement. Yeah, I see what you mean. Sure, Mom and Dad have had their share of arguments, usually about money, too." "And you ever get the impression they can't stand each other?" "Never," she admitted. She smiled. "Guess that's all a part of being married, huh?" Married. There, she realized at last she'd finally come right out and said it, and it hadn't been all that hard to do. Maybe the shock of this morning was beginning to wear off, or maybe she was starting to get comfortable with the idea. Tom took a seat on the arm of the chair and took her hands in his. "Look, Allie, maybe we did yesterday wasn't the smartest thing we ever did together, but I'd like to give it a shot. Test out this husband and wife thing for the next few days, just until it's time to head back home." He broke eye contact with her and focused his attention on their hands. "And if it doesn't feel like it's working out," he said softly, "we'll get one of those quickie divorces before we check out, and when we get back, you go your way, I'll go mine, and nobody will ever have to know what happened." "What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, huh?" she asked. Tom looked up and smiled. "Hey, that's what they say in all the advertising. No reason not to live up to it, right?" It was supposed to be a joke, but she didn't feel much like laughing. Just the opposite, in fact. She suddenly felt ashamed and could see that Tom felt the same way. It would mean they'd have to face that what they'd done here had been a terrible, terrible mistake. One that would become a dirty little secret they could never openly discuss once they arrived back in Illinois. An awkward 5-day gap in their lives that could very well put an end to their friendship. There was no doubt of it that in Allie's mind, once the divorce was settled, they'd never again be comfortable around one another. There'd be no other option than to drift apart and pretend it never happened. Was it worth losing Tom as a friend, she wondered, just to put this behind her, after all they'd been through together over the years? All right, so they'd gone and done something stupid. It sure as hell wasn't the first time, and maybe it wouldn't be the last. Probably wouldn't be the last. It was her idea, after all, and hadn't she agreed to go through with the ceremony when she was stone-cold sober? So didn't that mean some part of her had wanted to be more than a friend? The same part that really wanted her to be his wife, to share the rest of their days together? Would it hurt just to see what might happen if they gave it a try? Well, Allie said slowly, we can worry later about what we'll do before we get on the plane. Let's just see what happens in the meantime. Tom's eyes widened. You serious? Allie smiled, feeling her cheeks suddenly heat up. God, was she blushing? You know me, Tommy, she said, trying to sound nonchalant. I'm always up for trying different things, and if this doesn't count as different, I don't know what does. She shrugged. Till death do us part, right? Or until we can't stand being around each other, I guess. She grinned slyly. Although if you run into those pretty girls Ethel was talking about and let your dick do the thinking for you, it'll be one and not the other. You get me? Absolutely, Tom replied. He leaned down and Allie wrapped her arms around his neck to pull him close. She inhaled deeply, drawing the scent of him in, finding comfort in his embrace. She looked at the ring on her finger and rubbed it between the thumb and forefinger of her right hand. It felt strangely light and not as restricting as before. You think you got yourself a good man to watch out for you. You hold on to him tight, Ethel had told her. I'm sure gonna try, Allie thought, with an unexpected thrill, and she angled Tom's head slightly so she could kiss her husband. Now that felt pretty good, Warren said with a wide grin. Best thing that's happened to me today so far. Shauna smiled and leaned forward to give him another quick kiss on the lips. Always glad to help out, officer. Detective, he corrected. You telling me you never picked up any of the police terminology from watching all those episodes of Law and Order? Christ, they must run that show 900 times a day. Who pays attention to the dialogue? She asked playfully. I was all about Jerry Orbach, God rest his soul. That character he played? Lenny Briscoe, he replied. Yeah, now there was a real man, tough and sexy. Shauna sighed and smiled wistfully. I think that's what attracted me to you. Oh? Warren smirked and sat up a little straighter. 'Cause I'm so tough and sexy? She shook her head. No, 'cause of your graying hair. The smile drained off like water swirling down a toilet. Oh, he muttered, his spine slowly folding back to its normal slightly hunched configuration. So you've got the hots for me because I remind you of a TV character in the 60s. Terrific! Shauna laughed, then put a hand on her mouth to cover her lips when she realized the people near them had turned around to stare at her. Sorry, she said, eyes twinkling with mirth. They were sitting in a booth at the Riverboat, a small diner that was neither boat-shaped nor anywhere near a river, Boston Avenue being quite a few miles away from the waters of Lake Mead. But what it lacked in architecture it more than made up for in nautical decor. There were painted murals of riverboats trawling along the Mississippi on the walls, and the ceiling and floorboards were trimmed with white rope-like molding that, at intervals, formed what Warren assumed were meant to be various types of sailors' knots. The salt and pepper shakers on the table in front of them were shaped like stacks of gambling chips. The napkin dispenser was a plastic recreation of a poker hand, aces and eights. Apparently, the manufacturer and the riverboat's owners were unaware of the bad luck associated with the dead man's hand. And yet Warren and Shauna always sat in this booth, the one with the unlucky napkin dispenser and the placemats with the laminated pictures of actor James Garner as TV Western gambler Brett Maverick on them, whenever they came here to eat. Partly because they preferred to talk in private rather than at the counter, mostly because it was at the back of the diner facing the front door. For Warren, it was a habit born of teenage years pouring through the works of Mickey Spillane, Raymond Chandler, and Jim Thompson. Lessons learned? Never sit with your back to a door, so no one can sneak up on you. Always take the best vantage point in a public setting so you can watch everything that goes on around you. And never order the catch of the day. All right, so the last one didn't come from any potboiler crime novel, but from real life. Warren had learned it all by himself 2 months ago in this very eatery. Turned out it wasn't carp they served, but crap, undercooked crap that doubled him over so much he spent the night on the toilet with a severe case of the squats. If the riverboat wasn't within easy walking distance for Shauna from Merlin's Tower, he'd probably have never set foot in the place again, and then called in a health inspector to shut it down for good measure. But Shauna really liked the owners, and the diner was the sort of location favored by locals instead of the tourist trade. thus significantly lowering the number of loud Hawaiian print shirts he had to see during the course of a day. So he took what he learned from his intestinal escapade and used it as a constant reminder to avoid the seafood on future visits. The chili wasn't bad, though. "So how's your day been so far?" he asked Shauna. From the corner of his eye, he saw their waitress, an African-American girl probably no older than Shauna, dark hair tied back in a ponytail, approaching with the orders. Shauna picked up a fork as the waitress placed a small Caesar salad on the table. "The usual. Dory's being an asshole at rehearsal." "Dory?" he interrupted, sitting back to make room for the waitress as she moved around to his side. "She's one of the dancers, right?" A steaming bowl of chili thunked down on his placemat, obscuring James Garner's rugged features. He looked up at the girl. "Thanks." He glanced at her name tag. "Jasmine." She smiled pleasantly. "Let me know if y'all need anything else," she said, then walked off to attend to her other tables. "Dory's the dance captain," Shauna corrected him. "Oh, right, he said, nodding his head. The one he always thought of as the anorexic drag queen with the plastic surgery obsession. How old was the woman? Late 50s, early 60s? It was hard to tell with her face stretched back so much to get out of the wrinkles. She wound up looking like some demented cosmetic surgeon's experiment. He figured there must be some huge knot of flesh tied back under her page boy hairstyle, an obvious shoe-polished black wig worn, no doubt, to hide her thinning hair. And one of these days that thing was going to come undone and start unraveling, and God help the person unfortunate enough to witness it. They'd probably go off their fucking nut, as his old man would have put it, with all that loose skin flopping around Dory's head. Of course, he'd never voiced that opinion to Shauna. Exactly why he hadn't, he'd never been sure of. It was not as if the two women ever seemed to really get along. Maybe because she'd think it was being disrespectful, which, to be honest, it would be. Izzy thought it was pretty funny, however, but then Izzy was his partner. Shauna was his girl. Different worlds, different points of view, and with Shauna, he always tried to make sure those worlds never collided. Why bother her with all the shit he had to contend with? The shootings, the stabbings, the deaths of innocent children. She lived in a world of glamour and glitz, not murder and, well, outright evil. So who was he to go around tarnishing her fantasies? Let her enjoy life, he decided, while he wallowed around in the shit and the stink. It was better for both of them. But it was getting harder to do these days, to keep her and the job at opposite ends of the spectrum, he had to admit. The pressures of his caseload were starting to get to him, and there didn't seem to be any indication that they'd be easing off any time soon. Not with a 10-year-old boy lying on a slab in the morgue, his spirit crying out for justice. "So, as I was saying," Shauna continued, "Dory was being her typical asshole self, getting all nitpicky with us about the number in the third act. Then, one where the dancers are supposed to represent all the souls Morgana's stolen over the centuries." "That's the one where they got the guys in the harness flying around the stage, right?" Warren asked. He grabbed the pepper shaker and sprinkled a fair amount of the condiment into the chili, then picked up the cellophane-wrapped crackers that came with the meal. He crushed the saltines in their packaging, then ripped it open and dumped the crumbs into the mix. "Yeah, that's the one," Shauna replied. She stabbed at the lettuce in obvious frustration, then picked up the fork and waved it around, sending bits of shaved Parmesan cheese flying across the table. One piece bounced off the tip of Warren's nose and tumbled into the chili, where it quickly melted. "It's not like we haven't done the routine the same way for the past 100+ shows. You'd think it was obvious to that nasty old bitch we know what the hell we're doing by now." Warren picked up a spoon and began stirring his meal. "You got scared around the cats again, didn't you?" he asked without looking up. When he got no response, he glanced across the booth. Shauna shifted uncomfortably in her seat and looked away. "Yeah," she finally admitted. "Nothing to be ashamed of," he assured her for what must have been the 200th time. Not that he didn't mean it every time he said it. "Those fucking things are huge. I'd think twice about getting anywhere near them myself." "I guess," she sighed and let the fork drop onto the plate. "It's just—" "I know," he said consolingly, and reached over to hold her hand. He gave it a friendly tug and smiled. "Guess you can never really get used to a bunch of man-eaters prowling around. Maybe wondering what you taste like." Shauna shivered noticeably, and Warren slid over to wrap his arm around her shoulders. Shit, I'm sorry about that, honey, he said. Just said the first thing that popped in my head. I didn't mean to put the idea in yours, too. Yeah, well, she replied with a trace of sullen playfulness. Now I'll never be able to get it out. She paused. Not that it wasn't there to begin with. He pulled her closer and whispered, Well, maybe I can do something to take your mind off it tonight after the show. She giggled softly. I'm going to hold you to that, you know. You can hold that and anything else you'd like, baby, he said in his sexiest voice, like a typical white guy's impersonation of Barry White, low and deep, only without the soul. He slightly kissed her earlobe. Besides, I wouldn't say it if I didn't mean it. He reached up and took her chin between his thumb and forefinger and turned her lips toward his, fully intending to prove just how much he meant it when his cell phone chimed. God damn it, Warren muttered. He sat back and fished around in his jacket pockets for the phone. Sorry, honey. Shauna raised an inquisitive eyebrow as the musical tone continued sounding. Isn't that the music they play for Darth Vader in the movies? Uh-huh, he said. It wasn't in his jacket, so that left his trousers. He leaned toward the left to check the right pocket. Got tired of the theme from Magnum P.I. already? Shauna asked. Yeah, Warren replied, now feeling a mite embarrassed as some of the patrons turned around, clearly waiting for him to answer the ring so it would stop annoying them. He finally located the phone in his left pants pocket and flipped open the clamshell-like device. Ackerman, he paused to listen. Okay, be right out. He shut the phone and dropped it in his right jacket pocket, then looked to Shauna. Sorry, baby, I gotta go. Duty calls, huh? She looked disappointed. When doesn't it? Warren said wryly. He started to slide out of the booth. Izzy's waiting outside in the car. Working on a big case? Warren halted. He was hoping she wouldn't ask. Normally she didn't. Considering what he and Izzy were investigating, he knew she'd never be able to focus on her routines if he told her. And with 600-pound meat-eaters almost nipping at her heels, the last thing she needed to be thinking about was some poor dead kid. Big case? He shrugged. Nah, nothing you haven't heard about before. Just running down a few new leads on an old one. I'll tell you about it later. He exited from the booth, then stepped over to Shauna's side to give her a kiss. Tell that panther to back the fuck off next time he gets too close, okay? He playfully muttered. Remind him your boyfriend's a cop. I know people in animal control. They'll fix his National Geographic Explorer ass good if he steps out of line. She laughed softly. God, he loved that wind chimes and a gentle breeze sound. Such a tough guy, she commented with a smile. Bet you wouldn't say that if he were standing right next to you. Sure I would, sweetheart. I'm the one with the gun. He winked, then gave her a quick peck on the cheek. I'll call you later. He turned to leave. Love you, she said. He stopped and turned back. I love you too. He knew how stupidly wide his grin was, but fuck it. He felt like the luckiest goddamn guy in a town filled to the brim with losers, and he didn't give a shit if everybody knew it. Besides, he was about to leave her to make another descent into the pit, start another search for justice on behalf of someone incapable of doing so, and he'd take what few pleasures he could find before he set out. What was the old saying about homicide detectives? We speak for those who can't. Well, if he and Izzy got a hold of the bastard responsible for killing Danny LaRive, Warren would have a lot to say to him. See you after the show, okay? He told Shauna, then hurried off to meet his partner. Outside, the silly grin metamorphosed into a deep, worried frown. The lunch show was over. Time to get back on the clock. He looked up past the tops of the run-down buildings in this poor section of the city, close enough to the opulence of the Strip, and yet worlds apart financially, to gaze at the looming presence of the stratosphere just a few blocks away. Its saucer-shaped observation deck, the one made famous by the outdoor roller coaster that roared across its roof, always reminded him of the Jupiter 2, the spaceship on that old TV series Lost in Space, all ready for takeoff. And on the east side of the Strip, rising even higher into the bright blue sky, was the imposing sight of Merlin's Tower. According to the press, putting the tower directly across from the stratosphere, then building it 6 floors higher, not only stole away the title of tallest building in America west of the Mississippi from Bob Stupak's Dream Hotel Casino, but was Merlin's owner's impolite way of rubbing it in their neighbor's face. "Mine's bigger," the tower seemed to brag, "and you couldn't find a more prominent phallic symbol outside of a brothel." The sound of a car horn brought Warren back to earth. He found Izzy double-parked and got in on the passenger side of the unmarked police car. "Sorry about making you wait." "How's Shauna?" she asked. "Good, good," he replied. He fastened his seatbelt as Izzy pulled the car into traffic. "Hey, look," Warren said awkwardly. "I appreciate you letting me, meet up with her. After this morning, I felt like I really needed to see her, you know." "Don't sweat it," Izzy replied. "A case like this, knowing some animal could beat a little kid to death with his bare hands, you gotta catch the breaks when you can, right?" No argument there, Warren decided. "Hey, did you eat?" He gestured back in the direction of the riverboat. "I would have brought something out if you wanted." Izzy gave a short laugh. "After what happened to you with the fish in that place, I'd sooner go dumpster diving. No, I'm good. I sat in the park and had some leftovers from dinner last night that I brought along." "You know, you could have eaten with us," Warren said. "It didn't have to be at that diner. I'm sure Shauna would have been happy to go someplace else." Izzy grinned, keeping her eyes on the road. "Oh yeah, there's nothing like being the fifth wheel when your partner is trying to have a nice, quiet, intimate lunch with his significant other. Thanks, but I'll pass." She gave him a quick glance. "No offense, but I hope you're not expecting an invitation to tag along solo the next time Charlie and me go out to dinner. I mean, we like you and all, but—" "Wouldn't dream of it," Warren assured her. "With those kids of yours, the two of you need as much time alone as possible." "Damn straight," Izzy agreed. She maneuvered the car around Chester Stupak Park and onto Fairfield Avenue to eventually make their way back to the Strip. "Besides," he continued, "I get Charlie mad. He's liable to talk to some of his buddies at the power company and have them turn off my power." "And then there goes all those Tombstone pizzas stacked in your freezer," she said with a smile. "And the beer," he added in a mock serious tone. "Don't forget about the beer in the fridge. You take away my Coronas, I'm liable to go apeshit." He patted the left side of his jacket and the shoulder holster for the 9mm handgun underneath it. "Know what I'm talking about?" he said with a sly grin. "I'll keep that in mind," she said nonchalantly. "So what's the next stop on the Roberto Diaz tour?" Before Warren's lunch with Shauna, they'd spent the rest of the morning and part of the afternoon visiting the places Carolina Lariva had told them they might find her boyfriend. So far, they'd drawn a big goose egg on locating him. But that streak of bad luck wouldn't last. They were in the middle of a gambling town, right? Sooner or later, Warren had commented as they'd cruised the streets, everybody gets at least one break. And they, if not little Danny, were due for theirs. Warren took out his notepad and scanned the list they'd compiled. Clipped to the book was a small photograph of Diaz. He was a compact man in his late 30s, barrel-chested and wide-shouldered, with thick black hair cut short. His nose looked like it had been broken more than once and never been set quite right, and his brown eyes were set wide apart. A mustache that drooped over the corners of his mouth in a vaguely Pancho Villa-esque style obscured his upper lip, and his jawline was tinged blue with an eternal 5 o'clock shadow. The white straps of the wife-beater t-shirt he wore in the picture were a nice touch, Warren thought. Showed he was really stylish motherfucker. He was just as cute in person, according to his arrest record. Over the last 7 years, he'd accumulated a total of 6 counts of aggravated assault, 3 DUIs, a few drunk and disorderlies scattered here and there, and even a count of public lewdness, waving his cock at some female tourist coming out of the Golden Nugget Casino. Apparently, he offered her the chance to win a different kind of jackpot if she pulled on his lever. He told the arresting officers his drinking buddies Jim Beam and his old granddad had put him up to it. Oh, and just for good measure, there was an order of protection against him, courtesy of a former girlfriend who'd gotten tired of Bobby wailing on her whenever the mood came over him. There were no two ways about it. Roberto Diaz was a hard man with a nasty streak in him as long as Las Vegas Boulevard, and if he didn't turn out to be Danny Lariva's killer, Detective Warren Ackerman was going to be one very surprised cop. 1625 Ogden Avenue, he told Izzy. According to Mrs. Lariva, Diaz has a cousin who lives there, who's watching the apartment complex. Haslinger and McBride, Izzy replied. They were also from Homicide. They'll give us a shout if Diaz turns up. Nothing from the ME yet? It wasn't as though he was expecting the cause of Danny's death to be anything other than blunt force trauma, but he wasn't a medical examiner, and it didn't pay to make assumptions. Let the coroner do her job, and he'd be able to do his own all the better. Nope. Izzy glanced at him. You want to swing by the morgue and see if Winterstern has anything for us? Warren thought about it for a second, then shook his head. Nah, she'll let us know if she finds anything unusual. He drew a deep breath, then released it through his nostrils. You know, it's almost kind of funny in a sick, fucked-up way. What's that? She asked. Her confused expression made it obvious she didn't know where this was going. Warren let his head drop back against the headrest. Back when I was a rookie, a 10-year-old kid dying would have been the unusual thing. Now it's almost commonplace. He stared at the lining of the car's roof. To tell you the truth, Izzy, he said slowly, I'm getting sick of it all. Maybe it's time I hung it up. She hesitated before responding. Are you telling me you're thinking of retiring? Maybe, he admitted. And no, it's got nothing to do with you being my partner, he added quickly. She smiled, clearly grateful to hear that. That's good to know. So how long have you been thinking about it? He turned his head to gaze out the window. The Strip was bustling even with the rising midday temperature. Tourists must think they're impervious to heat, he considered. That, or they were just taking breaks from the frigid air-conditioned environments of the hotels. Out of the freezer and into the fire, then back again. The circle of desert life. About a year, he finally replied. Uh-huh, she said dully. And have you discussed it with Shauna? He frowned and looked back to his partner. No, I don't like talking about the job around her. Izzy pulled the car to a halt at a red light on the corner of Oakey Boulevard, then turned to glare at him. Why? You think you're protecting her by not telling her about the work you do? You selfish fuck? Hey, whoa! He said sharply, hands up in a gesture meant to cut off her reply. Where's that coming from? I'm a selfish fuck? You telling me you let Charlie in on everything you do? You used to tell him about all the Johns you picked up in those sting operations when you were working Vice? She started to say something, closed her mouth, then frowned. No, she said quietly. Not everything. He nodded, pleased with himself for scoring that point. Then you want to explain to me how I'm the selfish fuck? Because you don't tell Shauna anything, right? She shot back. At least I let Charlie in sometimes. Better he gets it from me than by reading it in the Review Journal or hearing it on the news. The blaring of a horn from the Humvee behind them interrupted Izzy before she could continue. A none too subtle way of the driver letting her know the light had changed. Izzy stomped on the gas. Besides, it's not healthy keeping that stuff bottled up inside. You know that, Warren. You think it's better having somebody to dump your shit on? Warren asked. Somebody you can burden with your problems? Izzy ground her teeth for a few moments. Jesus Christ, now I know why you've never gotten married, she muttered, then exhaled sharply. Look, Warren, it's not dumping your shit on somebody else. It's having somebody in your life you can turn to when you feel like the world's turned into one big goddamn cesspool. Somebody who can listen to your problems and you can listen to theirs, without either of you judging the other. No, I don't tell Charlie everything we do on this job. God knows there are times and things I'd like to forget all of it. But just knowing I have somebody to talk to when my shift's over, somebody to go home to who's loving and supportive and understanding, well, it just makes things easier to handle, you know? Makes getting up in the morning that much better before I have to jump back into the ship pool for another 100 laps. A wistful smile played at the corner of her lips. I thank God every day for Charlie. I don't know what I'd do without him. He's a good man, Warren said. Izzy glanced at him. So are you. When I'm not being a selfish fuck, he added with a half-smile. I'm serious, she said. I know, he replied. You're lucky to have Shauna. Warren nodded. No argument there, Izzy. And she's lucky to have you, Izzy continued. But keeping her at arm's length is no way to build a relationship, even if you think you're doing it for her benefit. And if you're thinking of calling it quits, well, then the two of you really need to sit down and have a long talk. Warren sat quietly, staring out through the windshield. With the thumb and forefinger of his right hand, he gently tugged at his bottom lip, mulling over Izzy's argument. She was right, of course. He might be a selfish fuck, but he wasn't a stupid one. He did need to come clean with Shauna. Let her know what he'd been considering. Give her a chance to let him know how she felt about it. The question now was when he should do it, and whether he'd have the balls to open the topic for discussion when that time came. "Thinking about it?" Izzy asked. "You know I'm right, don't you?" "Shut up," he said pleasantly. "You want to crow, go stand on the roof of your building and wait for the sun to come up tomorrow morning." "Cock-a-doodle-doo," Izzy said with a big grin. Yeah, Warren replied with mock huffiness. "Just drive the fucking car, all right?" Izzy laughed, knowing she'd scored the final goal, and turned her concentration to the road. Maybe tonight, Warren thought, when he picked Shauna up after the show. Or maybe not. Shauna watched as Warren joined Izzy in the car and they drove off. He'd seemed almost eager for an excuse to get away from her, and from the haunted look in his eyes, she knew it had to do with whatever new case he was working on. It must have been a really bad one, she considered. Most homicides didn't have such a noticeable effect on him. Not that he'd tell her if they did. In a way, it was sort of quaint how Warren always tried to sidestep the issue when she asked him about work. She knew what he was doing, trying not to worry her about the gruesome murders he investigated, the dangers he sometimes faced in tracking down the killers, trying to protect her from the bad men and the bad things they did. Shauna, however, didn't quite see it that way. To her, Warren's reluctance meant he was locking her out from a part of his life, an important goddamn part, and she didn't like it one bit. Sure, she might be terrified of the big cats at Magapalooza, but she wasn't fragile. She'd worked a night shift at a strip joint downtown, the most dangerous area in Las Vegas, hadn't she? Anybody who could survive that wasn't the sort of person who'd fall apart when they heard about a murder. Besides, watching that TV show CSI all these years had prepared her to hear the more disgusting aspects of Warren's cases, somewhat. After all, the autopsy stuff on CSI was all special effects and makeup. It wasn't real. And to be honest about it, she'd tried to watch a real autopsy on an HBO special once. She'd gotten as far as realizing that the reason she couldn't see the corpse's face was because the coroner had cut loose the guy's scalp and peeled it down to cover his features. Then she was running for the bathroom to throw up. After that, the rest of the evening had been spent watching the DVD box set of Sex and the City, Season 3. Carnality and shopping. 2 things guaranteed to take her mind off faceless cadavers. 3 things, actually. She still had the hots for Chris Noth, Mr. Big on the show, all the way back to when he was Mike Logan on Law & Order. Maybe in retrospect she didn't really need to know all the details of Warren's cases, but that didn't mean he had to shut her out completely. After all, bottling up his job-related emotions, the anger, the frustration, the horror, when they got together couldn't be doing him any good psychologically, or physically for that matter. Warren might resist any discussion of how he felt about the job, but she could plainly see the stress it was putting on him. It was in the weary set of his shoulders, the heavy tread of his walk, the dim light in his eyes that rarely sparkled with laughter any longer. Warren still possessed his odd sense of humor, but it had become darker over the last 6 months, even macabre in tone. He looked and sounded like a man who had been beaten down hard and often. And that, more than his reluctance to discuss the matter, was what truly worried Shauna. She'd considered bringing up the possibility of him quitting the force, a notion that occurred to her more often these days than she'd been willing to admit, but had always stopped herself from voicing the question. Warren was dedicated to his work, she knew that, and asking him to stop being a cop, if only for his health, would be like him asking her to give up dancing. And since that was never going to happen, barring serious injury or old age, she couldn't very well pressure him to do something he'd never think of doing himself. Shauna sighed. Maybe she was going at it the wrong way. So she wouldn't talk to Warren about leaving the job, but there was nothing wrong about suggesting he needed a break. She could convince him to take a few days off to clear his head, to recharge his batteries, as her dad would say. That wouldn't sound like she was being pushy, just concerned. Yeah, she thought with a smile, I could do that. Bailed on you, huh? Shauna started, nudged out of her reverie by the intruding voice. She looked up to find the waitress standing before her. Excuse me? Your boyfriend, the waitress said. He run out on you? Shauna smiled and shook her head. No, he had to go. He's a cop. He had to get back on the clock. Oh, okay. The waitress looked at the order pad in her hand. Stuck you with the bill, though. Got a lot on his mind, huh? Shauna chuckled. Yeah, guess you could say that. But I'll make sure he makes up for this. She winked slyly. The waitress smiled. Mm-hmm. Make sure he gives you a little something extra for the aggravation. You know it, Shauna replied. The waitress tallied up the amount for the 2 orders, then tore off the bill and placed it face down on the table. You have a good day now. You too, Shauna said. The woman nodded and walked away. Shauna dug into her purse for her wallet. Despite the joking around, she knew Warren would never have intended to stiff her on lunch. Apparently, her work question had rattled him more than she thought. Of course, that made her even more curious than usual. What could he be investigating now that asking if it were a big case would have such an effect on him? Maybe she'd turn on the radio when she got back to the dressing area and see if one of the local radio stations had any news about it. Hey, an intelligent girlfriend was a well-informed girlfriend, right? At least it continued to show she was interested in what he did for a living. And maybe by mentioning him in a conversation that she knew what he was up to, she could get him to open up to her about everything else he kept refusing to discuss. The question was when should she broach the subject, and whether she'd have the courage to actually go through with it when that time came. Shauna left a $3 tip for the waitress, paid the cashier for the meal, and left the air-conditioned comfort of the riverboat for the sweltering heat of a Nevada afternoon. She put on the pair of sunglasses she kept in her purse, then looked up at the tower, standing tall and impressive against the bright blue sky, and an idea began to form. Tomorrow was her one day off. No dancer could handle more than the required 6 shows a week, so maybe she could convince Warren to take her out for dinner tonight, up on the tower's rooftop observation deck. The view couldn't be beat, and he'd never gotten sick from the food at the Lady of the Lake restaurant up there, although the stomach-churning, high-speed elevator ride to get there had made her turn a little green once or twice. Still, the nausea would be worth the trip if it helped pry the cork loose from that emotional bottle he always carried around. Shauna smiled. Yeah, she thought, that's the ticket. A great view, a romantic candlelight dinner, a cool desert breeze. Put it all together, and you'll get one relaxed cop. The fact that he'd been trapped on the roof in a public setting, where he couldn't make a scene if she pressed too hard, made it just about foolproof. It was a simple plan, but a perfect one, as far as she could tell. Okay, guys, this has been the long Chapter 6 of Final Destination Dead Man's Hand. You know, going through most of tonight's upload, which I didn't think I was going to get to do for you guys because we've had some bad storms. I just happened to catch a couple hours in between storms. It's starting to light back up outside right now, so I'm going to have to make this quick. I didn't think I was going to enjoy tonight's chapter because I was like, okay, we've had a lot of backstory. We're getting even more. I think we've had enough. Let's get this book going. You know, and I thought that tonight when I got to the outro here, I was going to be complaining. But I gotta say, I actually enjoyed getting more backstory on Warren and Shauna. You know, we got some with Allie and Tom, but really tonight's chapter really centered around Warren and Shauna. And not only that, but the end of this chapter, I think, has set up the big calamity that's coming. The premonition. I can't be the only one that feels like this dinner she's going to go to, somehow Allie and Tom are going to be there, and the other characters, and this is going to be the premonition. So we're going to find out when I'm back very soon with more of Final Destination Dead Man's Hand. But I think we're almost there, guys. I think things are about to kick into high gear. So before I go tonight, once again, I want to thank the sponsors of this channel who brought you tonight's upload: Carl Eakins, Catherine McClear, and Sean Campbell over on the Patreon page. And if you would like to become a sponsor of the channel and get awesome benefits, like early access to certain uploads, exclusive content, free ebooks every 3 months, a free gift from the merch store every year, and so many other things, including having cameo voice roles in upcoming audiobooks, then check out the link in the description below and join up on the Patreon page. There's sponsorship tiers that start as low as $5 a month, and you would be doing a big service to the channel to help it keep growing. Guys, until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and